During Australia's recent election campaign, foreign affairs hardly made an appearance, despite Australia's recent combat deaths in the Afghanistan war. Now, one prominent analyst says our political leaders on both sides need to start confronting some tough policy challenges in the international arena, particularly the rise of China and what that may mean for America's influence in our region. Professor Hugh White is the author of Power Shift, Australia's Future Between Washington and Beijing. It's the latest instalment in the quarterly essay series. He joined me from our Canberra studio a short time ago. Professor White, thanks for coming in.
My pleasure, Lee.
You've written in Power Shift that when it comes to China's growing power, Australia will find itself in a different and perhaps more dangerous region, facing higher risks of conflict and fewer economic opportunities. What do you mean?
Well, I'm contrasting the future we might be facing over the next few years and few decades with the remarkably good period we've had for the last 40 years, where US uncontested primacy in the Asia-Pacific region has given Asia and Australia a really wonderful ride. And my fear is that if, as China grows, the US-China relationship becomes more competitive, more contested, then we're going to find ourselves in a different kind of world in which the peace of Asia is not nearly so guaranteed and the economic opportunities for Australia, particularly our economic opportunities with China, might be more constricted. So the risks that we're going to end up in a world in which we either don't have the economic opportunities we've had for the last 40 years, or don't have such a peaceful environment as we've had for the last 40 years, or don't have either of those things, could be quite high.
What would the US and China be competing over?
Well, in the end, most of the big strategic competitions in history don't take place over, so to speak, economically rational things like access to resources and that sort of thing. They compete over status. They compete over who's going to be the most important country in the region. And I think what we see at the moment is an America which has, for many years, been the leader of Asia and would like to hang on to that status very much indeed, and a China which, as its power grows, as it becomes richer, as it becomes stronger, wants and expects to become more influential. I think would like, if it could, to become the leader of the region itself. So I think the heart of the competition that we're seeing emerging is over who will be the leader in the region, who will be the country that is the dominant power in Asia.
But as you point out, that region has been very stable for the past 40 years or so. Why would anyone allow that to change, given that stability is obviously in everyone's interest? Wouldn't the desire for stability override some of the other pressures that you've talked about?
Well, you'd hope so, and that might prove to be the case. And it's very much in Australia's interest and everybody's interest that we do what we can to make sure that's the case. But the problem is that everyone in the region can want the region to be peaceful, but they can still fail to recognise or fail to be willing to make the concessions that are needed to bring that about. So the people in America, of course, want Asia to be peaceful, but they expect China to continue to accept American primacy. People in China want Asia to be peaceful, but they expect America to make way for China as its power grows. And the risk is that neither of those things will happen, so the two will find themselves drifting into a more competitive relationship, which neither of them really want, because neither of them are prepared to make the concessions that are needed to make that kind of sharing of power possible.
And you argue in the essay that between the US and China, this, I think you refer to it as this drift towards antagonism is already evident. What is the evidence for that?
Well, if you look, for example, at the way in which the US and China have sort of bumped up against one another just over the last few weeks on the South China Sea, where China has upped the rhetoric about its claims to the South China Sea, and America has upped its rhetoric on its determination to resist China's claims to the South China Sea. Moving further north again, just over the last few weeks, the Chinese have responded very negatively to American exercises with the Koreans off the Korean peninsula with the South Koreans. The Americans have responded negatively to that in turn. You can see a quite distinct drift towards the symbolism of these naval exercises, these naval activities, reflecting the determination by America to retain its primacy as the biggest maritime power, the biggest naval power in Asia, and China just trying to push the boundaries as much as it can. And you can also see behind that, for example, at things like Copenhagen last year, where the US clearly expected its leadership to be accepted as the principal power that would shape the way in which the Copenhagen outcome on climate change would occur, and the Chinese determination not to be cast into that subordinate position, and some of the diplomatic sort of manoeuvring that went on there seemed to me to reflect a very much more competitive relationship than we've seen before.
US foreign policy towards China now for a while has been characterised by a bit of a hedging approach where they're hoping for positive outcomes but hedging against that for negative outcomes. They seem to accept, as I think you've said, that we'll accommodate China's growing power as long as they respect our primacy. That policy, as we say, has ensured stability for a while. Could that policy work if it kept going?
Well, it has worked so far for America because China has been prepared to accept the frame that America has set up for it. China has been prepared to accept, really for decades now, ever since it started growing economically, that it would have to constrain its ambitions, constrain its expectations within the US-led order which has existed in Asia and globally for so long. But as China's power has increased, as it's got stronger in relation to America, as it started to push up against the boundaries of that policy, I think the Chinese are becoming less accepting of the constraints that America's trying to impose on it, and America has become more worried that China will in fact push up against it, start to challenge its primacy and start to become a kind of a structural adversary. So I think for both sides, that old deal, which has worked so well for so long, is starting to break apart.
So what then are the options for US foreign policy towards China and its role and influence in the region generally?
Well, I think when we look into the future, and some of these issues might take a decade or two to unfold, the US has got really three options. It could withdraw from Asia. As China grows, if China keeps growing, which I think it probably will, the US could conceivably just say, look, it's not worth our while competing with the Chinese, we'll just leave the Asians to look after themselves. I don't think that's very likely, but I don't think we could for a moment dismiss it as impossible. Alternatively, it could try to share power with China. That is to say to the Chinese, you're getting stronger, we'll work with you, we'll stay an active presence in the Western Pacific, but we won't try and dominate. That would be the best outcome from Asia's point of view, good from Australia's point of view too, but I think not that likely because it would require such big concessions on both sides. The third option, I think unfortunately the most likely, is that the US will try and compete with China. As China's power grows, as China tries to assert more leadership, as we've seen over the last year or so, the US pushes back, trying to reassert its leadership and very likely, I think, drawing the US and China into a more competitive relationship. And it's that third option which I think we're already drifting towards, and which the further that drift goes, the harder we're going to have to work to pull back from it and move back to something more like the second option, the sort of cooperative and collaborative option.
But won't some of those competitive impulses in that type of strategic realm be mitigated by the increasing economic interdependence, not just between those two countries, but between all the countries in the region?
Well, certainly that gives us all a huge stake in preventing that happening. And of course there are huge interests in the US and in China in making sure that relationship continues to work. The trouble is that unless the people making the decisions, leaders on both sides, recognise that in order to keep the economic benefits flowing to both sides, they're going to have to make concessions, then it's quite possible for the strategic, the nationalistic ambitions of both sides to outweigh the economic incentives which should push them towards cooperation. Almost everyone in America recognises it's very important for the United States to get on well with China. But if you ask Americans whether they're prepared to treat China as an equal as China's power grows, very rare that you get a yes answer to that. So I think the recognition of the importance of the economics is one thing. The recognition of what's needed to keep a stable relationship with China as China keeps growing is quite another, and I don't think we've seen that.
Doesn't some of this discussion assume that there's going to be this steady, inexorable rise of China, when the reality is that there are heaps of factors that could ensure that that's not the case?
Absolutely, and I think it's very important to stress that all of these things occur if China keeps growing. And I think you're right, we shouldn't for a moment assume that that's inevitable. But neither should we assume that it won't happen. In fact, on balance, I think it's more likely that China will keep growing because notwithstanding all the problems, I think the deep underlying factors, the long-term historical factors which have driven China's growth over the last 30 years remain very powerful. And I think that the most likely outcome is that China will continue to grow for the next 30 years as it has for the last 30. And that does mean it will overtake the United States to become the strongest country in the world. And that's a shift in the way the world works of really historic proportions. You know, the United States has been the strongest, richest country in the world since 1880. You have to go back 200 years to the point where China was last the strongest country in the world. So this is a really big trend we're watching.
And so where does Australia fit in all of this then?
Well, Australia has grown up for 200 years, ever since really the present country was founded. Australia has lived in a world which has been dominated first by Britain and then by the United States, and both of those countries have been in turn our very close allies, and they've dominated Asia and made it easy for Australia to live safely on the edge of Asia. So for us this is a very big set of developments indeed. If over the next decade or two the United States ceases to be the primary power in Asia, then we will be for the first time looking at an international environment which works quite differently from what we've known in the past. And we'll have to make some very big choices. If the US-China relationship becomes more strategically competitive, as I fear it will, we'll have to decide whether we side with the United States in that kind of competition, whether we support America in trying to maintain its primacy against China, or whether we don't go that route, whether we pull back and become more impartial, more neutral perhaps let the alliance with the United States go. That would be for Australia a terrifically difficult, traumatic decision to make, but on the other hand, seeing ourselves being drawn into an increasingly contested relationship with China, our biggest trading partner, would also be very difficult for us.
We're on the cusp, one would hope, of a new government. Is either side of politics better equipped to deal with this set of challenges than the other, in your view?
Look, I don't think they are. I think both sides of politics are going to find it very hard to deal with these kinds of challenges. For a start, neither of the leaders have a lot of background in foreign affairs, foreign policy, strategic policy sort of issues. None of them, for example, bring to the job the kind of credentials on these issues that Kevin Rudd brought to bear. On the other hand, Kevin Rudd didn't actually do much on these issues when all was said and done, partly, I think, because they are so difficult politically, and I think one of our problems is that whoever emerges from the present strange parliamentary arithmetic in charge of the government will end up finding it very difficult to lead what will anyway be in Australia a very difficult, contentious, I think quite painful national debate about how we respond to this very different international environment. And I think they'll also find it hard to get the time to do it, because there's so much of their energy will be absorbed managing such a difficult parliamentary situation. So,
I mean, we saw during the election campaign foreign affairs and foreign policy very much on the back burner. It sounds like you would presume that will continue under the current political situation. Well,
I fear it will, unless and until some crisis thrusts it to our attention, and by then it might be too late for Australia to do much. I think there are things Australia can do if our leaders have got the time and energy and courage to push them forward. We can talk to the United States about how we think America should approach China's challenge. We can talk to China about how we think Asia should evolve, but we can't do any of those things until we've reached some decisions here at home amongst ourselves, and I think the risk is that debate just won't happen until it's too late.
You've said that it could be a painful and difficult national debate, that it's a very big set of developments that we're facing. But in Australia's history, it's had to deal with major strategic shifts at the end of the 19th century when the British Empire's influence was waning. After the Second World War, when we've seen European powers in the region have their sort of role and influence diminished. When those things have happened, we haven't been ruined. Why would it be any different this time?
Well, you're right. I think we have been through changes of this magnitude, but only about two. I think those two are exactly the right ones. And what we found in each of those occasions is that Australian governments, the Australian political system, recognise the scale of the challenges, and big characters like Alfred Deakin in the first of those big crises at the end of the 19th century, Percy Spender at the end of the Second World War, really reshaped Australia's foreign policy, reshaped our approach to strategic affairs, and made a big difference to the way we responded. Now, I think we can get through this. I think we can build a new kind of international posture for Australia in a very different kind of Asia. But we won't do that unless we can really understand the challenges we're facing, see how different it's going to be, and not pretend to ourselves that the kind of foreign policy which has worked so well for us for the last 40 years will keep on working indefinitely in an Asia which is, frankly, structured in a very different way, and which the balance of power, the power structures are going to work very differently.
Professor Hugh White, thank you. It was very fun to talk about foreign policy tonight instead of domestic politics. Thank you for coming in.
It's my pleasure. Thanks very much, Lee.